How's it going, guys? Um, Sorry for the bad quality here, but I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize. We're still gonna get through this though. Today we're gonna be talking about Mendelian genetics. Uh, so let's jump right into it. Yeah. Just basically an overview of what we're gonna be talking about today. We're gonna be talking about genotype and phenotypes, behavior and genes, among other subtopics through that. We're gonna talk about Mendelian's experimental design, what he learned through his research, including Punnett squares, inheritance, traits, and among other things. We're going to talk about neo-Darwinian synthesis. Basically, we touched on this the first week. We sort of mentioned how DNA has this ability to change throughout time, essentially making organisms stronger in order to survive their environment. And that has to do with neo-Darwinian synthesis. I guess the best example would be, in Galapagos Island, how birds evolved to sort of eat certain types of food, live in certain environments. It's kind of a similar thing. When we talk about a statistical analysis of genetic data, and we're going to touch a little bit on some controversies on some of the topics we're going to be discussing today. So we start with genotype and phenotype. So genotype is basically a set of genes that an organism possesses. For example, myself, I have a gene that gives me height, it gives me good looks, it gives me a certain eye color, hair color, uh, and even my type of behavior. I do wholeheartedly believe that your your behavior runs through your blood. There's a good Mexican song from Jorge Negrete, uh, and he basically talks about how people from the state of Jalisco, and I know this for a fact. I know people from like Michoacan. These people tend to have a tendency for aggressiveness, and they don't tolerate very much. I do believe that certain types of people have this innate genetic function that affects their behavior. A phenotype is quite similar. It's basically the physical appearance of a gene. And so that includes the eye color, height, behavior. It's basically your gene being expressed as a phenotype. So it's interesting we talk about behavior. I feel like that's a topic that's not really discussed much. But I do believe that, and given the research that I've gone through, that phenotypes, behaviors are included in phenotypes. They are a projection of genetic factors. Behavior itself is a complex trait. I mean, there's a whole psychological aspect of it. I mean, people, get medical degrees in studying human behavior. Everybody's behavior is different. Brain chemistry affects it. Environmental factors, I think, have probably the biggest effect. Uh, but there are people that are born, for example, with schizophrenia, and that's a genetic mutations that happens, and it ends up becoming an outward projection, and usually violent. It's important to note that the underlying genetic framework for behavior is still much to be researched. It's still, in my opinion, primitive in a way. Uh, I think if you're interested in perhaps pursuing a career in genetic behavior, I think that'd be a great avenue to follow. So now we're gonna sort of touch more into depth of how behavior and genes work together. Um, so as I mentioned before, research suggests that genotypes can influence behavior, but the relationship isn't, rudimentary. It's not set. For example, autism. Studies have identified several genetic variants, right? People say you're on a spectrum. There's just so many variants in autism. You have speech impediments, you have um, behavioral impediments, you have communication impediments. There's so many different variants through autism that honestly, from what I've read, are mostly genetic. But there are environmental factors that play. For example, a sudden or severe trauma could cause a person to sort of close themselves, sort of close their psychological behavior. And that includes talking. If they go through something traumatic, they could stop talking, they could stop eating, they could stop communicating with other people. And it's usually a defense mechanism. It's just the way our brains work, the way our brains are wired to sort of just protect us from pain, to keep us in a position where, um, oh, in a position where we can function to a certain extent. I even read that air pollution has can play an environmental factor on autism. Um, I do wholeheartedly believe that electrical fields can also uh, disturb brain functions. A certain type of frequency as well. I think what is unknown should definitely be considered, sort of like wavelengths and colors, among other things. I mean, we can't even see all colors on the spectrum. We can't even comprehend wavelengths. And if these are going through our chemistry and sort of rewriting it in a sense, I think that's should warrant some mention. Homosexuality. This is a big one here. Uh, is it genetic? That remains to be determined. That the research for this is far too primitive. Far too primitive. Uh, I know for certain it is a environmental factor. For sure, it is determined by a person's environment. Um, I guess we could put this, for example, if a person is raised in an area where homosexuality is prominent and it's widely accepted, um, more often than not, this person is gonna at least maybe experiment or try this sort of behavior. Um, Probably should be noted that homosexuality in of itself is anti-Darwinism. It defies biology itself. You don't pass on your genes, right? Uh, there are different types of sexes in homosexuality, but the straightforward type, we we go against what is human biology, and that is to pass on our genes to the next generation. You've succeeded. You delivered offspring. So, I mean, it's like I say, these topics are all primitive. There's so many mechanisms that could play a part in in these topics. I think the biggest one is probably the metaphase plate. When your chromosomes align on the metaphase plate, I mean, there's millions, millions of combinations that could happen, and this all affects skin color. I honestly believe that behavior and psychological factors are often determined here. I think it definitely influences sexual orientation. Altruism certainly could have a genetic component. Uh, Perhaps a person who grew up in war, in a wartime, a war child, we could say, will have a different association with other humans. They'll have a different upbringing, social norms, and this could be outwardly aggressive, or it can be internally submissive. Uh, but altruism does play a heavy psychological factor on certain people. I mean, we've had cases here in the United States where people have taken their own lives, again, defying Darwinism, right? To survive as long as possible, to pass on your genes, to give up on your basic biology because of an environmental factor. Religion, without a doubt, determines a great deal of genetic variance. For example, myself, I wholeheartedly believe that my personality is determined by a set of factors, a foundation that was laid to me as a child, and that I follow to this day. Um, and this goes back to altruism. I think altruism could possibly fall under this category. But increased spirituality and religiousness, and these environmental factors affect cultural background, upbringing. They play a significant role in shaping a person's religion. Politics, without a doubt. I think we can see that today, how politics changes people. There's a great division in our country. Factors that influence political ideology with certain genetic variants. Areas that you're born in. Conservatism versus liberalism. A person born in California is obviously going to think different from someone that was born in Texas, right? Even certain freedoms that other people have, like the ability to work with recreational drugs or experience recreational drugs, that same idea doesn't exist in certain places. But in short, we're going to touch more on some of these topics at the end of the presentation, but I think it's important to note how environment deeply affects genetic behaviors, how it affects genotype, how it's directly associated with genotypes, and then is projected as a phenotype, which includes behavior. Unfortunately, a lot of this research is still primitive. Especially with homosexuality, a lot of people believe that, that's a decision that you make. Whether that is true remains to be determined. But we'll touch more on some of these topics here in a little bit. So, Mendel, Gregor Mendel, he brilliant, absolutely brilliant man. He grew up in a church. He grew up in the church. He became a deacon. He went back to his hometown to live in his church, and he conducted experiments in his garden. He was an absolutely brilliant man. He worked with peas to determine traits, to determine inheritance, to determine environmental factors, and all these traits that shape phenotypes. The concept of epigenetics suggests that environmental factors can affect gene expression, which in turn influences phenotype, as we mentioned. For example, environmental stressors can trigger changes in gene expression that affect behavior. Mendel's experiments on peas laid the foundation for modern genetics. He used a monohybrid cross to study inheritance of single traits. And these included flower cutter, seed type. He had wrinkly seeds versus round seeds. And he determined that every offspring contained a dominant and recessive gene, and every fourth generation actually had both recessive genes, so there was a chance to have a certain type of color that was not, it did not occur as often as having another type of color or even its seed type. He even determined plant heights. His laws of segregation and independent assortment describe how genes are inherited and sorted during meiosis. I'll be right back. So as I mentioned, the law of segregation states that each pair of allele, and it's a form of a gene, separates from each other during gamete formation, during meiosis, resulting in a gamete receiving one allele from each parent, and it contributes to a certain trait in the offspring. So, in short, each pair of alleles separates during meiosis, or gamete formation. Each gamete receives only one allele from each pair, and the alleles are randomly assorted into gametes. So an example would possibly be consider a gene that determines flower color with two alleles, red and white, a capital R and a lowercase r. A parent with the genotype RR heterozygous will produce gametes with either the R alleles or the R lowercase allele, but not both. The law of independent assortment. It states that different genes are sorted independently of each other during gamete formation. This means that the alleles of one gene do not influence the alleles of another gene. So different genes are sorted independently during meiosis. The alleles of one gene do not affect the alleles of another gene. And the combination of alleles from different genes is random. So consider two genes, one that determines flower color, again R and a lowercase r, and another that determines plant height, so T or T, lowercase t and a capital T. A parent with the genotype dominant and recessive RR, TT, so all four combinations, heterozygous for both genes, will produce gametes with random combination of alleles. So we'll have basically a combination of everything. I believe this would be a 1 in 16 chance on a Punnett square. We'll get to Punnett squares here in a second. So in short, to summarize, Mendel's experiments with pea plants demonstrated the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. He crossed plants with different traits, such as flower color, plant height, seed type, observed the resulting offspring. By analyzing the data, he was able to infer the underlying genetic principles that govern the inheritance of these traits. So now we'll get into Punnett squares. I sort of mentioned this. This is one of my favorite topics to go over. Punnett squares are a graphical representation of the possible genotypes and phenotypes that can result from a cross between two parents. It's basically a probability chart that you can use to predict traits in offspring. Punnett squares show that offspring can have one of many genotypes and the corresponding phenotypes, and be it color, plant height, etc. Some of the traits that we've mentioned before. I'll be back. Sorry about that. There are several types of Punnett squares. You have a monohybrid Punnett square. You have a dihybrid Punnett square to determine one or two traits respectively, and then you have a trihybrid, which of course determines the three traits. You can use all kinds of Punnett squares to determine the probability. People enjoy using Punnett squares because they're relatively simple to use and determine. There are some limitations to Punnett squares, though. Assume a simple Mendelian pattern of inheritance and do not take into account environmental factors. As we've already stated, that environmental factor plays a major role in genetics, and do not account for genetic interactions or epistasis. Overall, Punnett squares are a powerful tool, and they help us understand the probability of different traits, but they should definitely be used in conjunction with other tools and techniques that exist today, especially gene deletion or gene addition now with gene therapy and just one of the major complex tools that exist today. But Punnett squares are still a viable source of studying genetics. So neo-Darwinism, it's sort of what we touched in the first week of class. It's basically an evolutionary theory that combines Darwin's theory of evolution with natural selection and Mendel's law of inheritance. So this is sort of a framework that explains how genetic variation could happen, how it is sorted during evolution, especially environmental pressures, as I mentioned before, the Galapagos Island, how they shape the evolution of traits, so beak length, even talons, whether they're there or not, um, uh, colors, for camouflage, all kinds of things that a organism could evolve into in order to become a more viable specimen to survive and pass on its genes. Uh, the chi-squared test is a statistical method used to analyze genetic data and determine whether frequencies of traits differ significantly from expected frequencies under a null hypothesis. This test is commonly used in genetic association studies to identify genetic variants. It's associated with specific traits uh, or diseases. So it's basically someone looking um, for a certain trait or a certain gene that could cause disease or potential problems in a person or organism. I think one could probably be an inherited disease, possibly diabetes, we could say. Um, how a person could be, you know, genetically affected by diabetes, which does tend to happen, especially in Mexican households, right? We love our tortillas. Um, and so basically, what these scientists do is they find these genes, they analyze this genetic data, and they can determine. Oh, one second. That's just one of the many factors that it could be used for. It's genetic association, epidemiology, sociology, even. It tests for associations between social variables and outcomes, and it's even used in psychology. It does have limitations. It's a fairly simple test, and it takes from a random sample of a population, unless it's to me if it's taken from a family. Let's say if you're trying to determine if a disease could be passed down, I think the results could be uh, far more significant, and it would get rejected, I guess you could say, and there will be a association between the variables. It may not be suitable for small sample sizes or sparse data, and it may not account for confounding variables or interactions between variables. Yeah. So now we're gonna touch on some sensitive topics here. Um, I know we mentioned earlier uh, homosexuality and many other topics like autism. I think the most important thing to remember when you talk about these topics is to approach it with respect and sensitivity. Uh, a lot of people tend to get quite sensitive about this topic, especially if it's something that they can associate with. Never make an assumption. Never make an assumption. Uh, that is why I specifically mentioned that the research is quite primitive. So it doesn't state that it exists or that it doesn't exist. The possibility is always there. Um, and then that's what we look at. We look at scientific evidence and we avoid personal opinions or bias, except for the fact when I mentioned my own personal spirituality. Uh, I mean, these topics are super complex, right? It's not a simple topic. It's not basic. It's heavily rooted in a complexity, uh, especially homosexuality. I mean, I do believe that when certain chromosomes are lining up or being inherited, there's a lot of variables. I mean, this could even include is the person under the influence when the child was conceived. There's just so many environmental factors that could affect the genotype, uh, and so that's why it's important to not expect a simple answer. I think that the complexity serves a good purpose to promote research and to promote new ideas. Always encourage open and respectful dialogue. Never say a personal opinion, right, or a bias, or pass a judgment, I guess we could say. Listen to different people's perspectives and see where they come from. I think these ground rules can lead to a productive, respectful, and overall beneficial discussion in the complex relationship between genotype, environments, and behavior. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about Mendelian genetics. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section. And I'll see you guys in the next video.